95% of you know that historically Poland refused to give up the Danzig and the corridor to Germany. This gave another reason for Germany to invade Poland, starting World War II. France and Britain defended Poland. More and more countries got involved and were invaded over time. But what if Poland agreed to give up some of their lands? Would peace be preserved in Europe? I'm sure that you're at least familiar with how the Second World War went, as it is perhaps the most popular war out there. I'll not bore you with the details, but I need to give you some context. When Germany was the First World War, Poland emerged as a young nation. The Poles were awarded the Danzig corridor, which bothered many Germans, since it split the country in two. To understand why the Second World War went the way it did, I want to mention the policy of appeasement. France and Britain were the initiators of the policy, and their goal was to give Germany everything that they had wanted. They let Germany annex the Saarland, remilitarize the Rhineland, annex Austria, annex the Sudetenland, and then the rest of Czechoslovakia, take Memel from Lithuania, and now the Germans were demanding Danzig from Poland. The reason for letting Germany have so much and not fighting them initially is simple. France and Britain were not ready for a war with Germany, so the policy would give them more time to prepare for a future conflict. The Germans built the most modern army in the world at the time. Officially, they were restricted by the Treaty of Versailles, which limited the German army count to 100,000. In reality, Germany went a bit over that number. How much do you ask? Well, according to estimates, they had between 1.5 million and 2 million active personnel by the time of the war. Since the Germans were allowed to take so much land without any backwash, they were surprised when the Allies defended Poland when Germany invaded. The rest after that is history, as we all know how the Second World War ended. This scenario is not about what if appeasement had continued, it's about what if Poland voluntarily gave up the Danzig corridor to Germany instead of relying on France and Britain for help. Historically, when Germany invaded, the Soviet Union also joined the invasion. The two countries previously signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, splitting Eastern Europe among themselves. By that time, it would be too late for Poland to give up any land. I'm sure that the country would realize their position in Europe a while ago. After all, they were built on former German and Russian lands. Both countries were eager to reclaim what they saw as theirs, restoring their glory. The Polish were historically partitioned many times among their neighbors. To avoid that, Poland should side with one of their neighbors by giving them their claimed lands, and in return they join their faction and get promised protection. Since the video is about Poland giving up the Danzig corridor to Germany, the Poles would ally with Germany, going against the Soviet Union. The reason for that is simple. In red, you can see the lands that Poland needs to give up to the Soviet Union in order to secure an alliance with them. On the other hand, in blue, you see the lands that they would need to give up to Germany so they can secure an alliance. In terms of population, in the blue area resided a bit more than 3 million people, while in red were 4 times as much people, around 12.5 million. It makes more sense to give up less territory and population, despite it being better developed than the sparsely populated Polish East. Now I know what you're thinking. The Polish East was barely Polish, as it was mainly inhabited by Belarusians and Ukrainians. Logically, it makes more sense to give up these lands and not have to deal with minorities, causing problems and demanding independence. The thing is that Poland would lose on 12.5 million people instead of just 3 million. This could very well cripple the nation and make it not worth it. Let me know if you want to see a video where Poland sides with the Soviet Union before the German invasion. Now the question becomes, how could Poland ally with Germany? The Polish government at the time, before the German invasion, wouldn't accept to give up the Danzig corridor, so we need a change of leadership. The best Polish political party to rule Poland is the National Radical Camp. The party is ultra-nationalist, patriotic and anti-Semitic, which is exactly the same in ideology as the ruling party in Germany at the time. If you play hard to fire and for, by going the ultra-nationalist path, you side with this party, but there is a massive problem with that. The problem with that is that this party was banned in July 1934, quite literally 2 months after it was created. The party also consisted of just 5,000 members, which is by far not enough to lead a nation of 32 million people. If that were to happen, a civil war is imminent. A better alternative is the National Party, which had 200,000 members before the Second World War, being the largest opposition party at the time. The party's ideology was Polish nationalism and national Catholicism. The main goal of the party was the construction of a national, Catholic, Polish state. It differs a bit from the German party in ideology, but is a welcome ally. If you want any proof, here you can see a march, where the members use the Roman salute, which is also used by the Germans. In the party, there were two main factions competing for dominance, the old generation and the young generation. They would split the power evenly between themselves, as one candidate becomes the chancellor and another becomes the prime minister. The difference in ideology, I assume, wouldn't be a big problem. Bulgaria also sided with the Germans, but the Bulgarians had a completely different ruling party and also were a kingdom, led by Boris III. The Polish National Party is more realistic to rule Poland, compared to the National Radical camp. Because in the 1930 election, 12.7% of the population voted for the National Party. This number can grow if the German ruling party sponsors them, increasing their numbers. A civil war is likely where the Germans would support the National Party and as a result would get an ally in the east. This is how Germany could get Poland to give up the Danzig corridor, by also promising to protect Poland from Soviet aggression and maybe give them another coastline. The allies of France and Britain wouldn't be able to stop it for two reasons. The first reason is that they would have already tried that in a potential Polish civil war, where they would fund the original Polish government, which was against Germany. This would prove ineffective, as a possible Polish civil war would happen in the mid-1930s. As I mentioned, the Allies were still rearming and couldn't face Germany in an open war. That's the reason they chose appeasement. The Allies would simply not be able to overcome Germany in this proxy war. The second reason why France and Britain wouldn't be able to put their foot down and stop German aggression is the reason that Poland voluntarily gave up these lands in exchange for guarantees, as the whole of Poland gets into the German sphere of influence. This would greatly anger the Soviet Union. I assume that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact wouldn't be signed between the USSR and Germany. Italy and Germany were also improving relations for years now, so they would sign the Pact of Steel, forming an alliance between each other. Poland had just lost their coastline, so naturally they would want to regain it. Germany not only promised to protect them from the Soviet Union, but also hinted towards invading Lithuania and giving them to Poland. This would restore the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Speaking of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, I have a rare silver coin from 1583. At the time, Poland and Lithuania were about the largest in terms of population and territory. Now, back to the video. Before that happens, I assume that the Soviet Union would pursue more aggressive policies. The Soviet Union would demand Bessarabia from Romania, and they would get it without a problem, while also invading Finland, starting the Winter War. In mid-1940, the Germans and the Polish would invade Lithuania. The allies of France and Britain would declare mobilization and move troops to the German border. A war between the two sides is looking likely. The Soviet Union would be greatly annoyed at what is happening in Europe and that the Germans are going into their sphere of influence. This leads me to think that the Soviet Union would invade Poland. As a result, Germany would join the war. The German Chancellor has stated in his book that one of his main goals is to destroy the Soviet Union, and this would be the best opportunity he would get. Romania and Hungary would be pressured to join the war. Hungary would be given Transylvania if they join, and Romania would regain Bessarabia plus some more Soviet land as to compensate for them losing Transylvania. The war between Germany and the Soviet Union would get started in mid-1940, 1 year earlier than in our timeline. The difference is that the Germans wouldn't be fighting the Allies, so they would be able to concentrate their entire might on the Soviet front line. The Germans also don't have to worry about policing occupied lands, sending forces to Africa to help Italy, worrying about possible Allied landing, and even don't have to worry about the USA joining. This is because the Germans are not at war with Britain. Poland is also promised some lands so they can restore the former borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Romania would be eager to reclaim what they had lost a year prior to that. This makes each German ally very determined to fight, which is bad news for the Soviet Union. The USSR also suffered from a massive purge, and by the time of the war, they still hadn't recovered. Historically, when the war was a year later, they also hadn't recovered. All odds are in favor of Germany and against the Soviet Union. The German coalition would make great gains, but would still suffer from supply issues. A couple of days after the beginning of the invasion, Finland would also join, as they seek to reclaim the lands they had just lost to the Soviets and maybe take some more. The Allies would try their best to help the Soviet Union as much as possible, but they wouldn't declare war on the Germans officially. Now, if you're wondering why the Allies wouldn't conquer Germany while they're still busy, let me answer that question. Why would they? One of the Allies' goals of appeasement was to move Germany's goals to the east, so they would eventually clash with the Soviet Union. When that happens, both sides would be exhausted by the time of a peace treaty. Then, the Allies can simply invade the country left standing and defeat them easily, making them control of Europe. The Allies would send guns and advisors to the Soviet Union just because they wanted to even out the battlefield, taking more German casualties in the process. The Soviets would be on the back burner, where they would lose city after city, getting pushed back to Moscow. Scorched earth tactics would slow down the Germans. Partisans behind the alliance would destroy German supply, but still, I would say that there is no hope for the Soviets. The Germans would finally achieve victory after 2 years of war, with the conflict ending in late 1943. Finland would gain their lost lands and also the whole of Kola Peninsula. Romania would get Bessarabia as well as their promised lands in Ukraine. Poland-Lithuania would expand their borders, reaching the Black Sea and controlling most of Ukraine. They were already a German puppet state, so it wouldn't be a problem for the Germans. The Don-Kuban area would become its own state, under German leadership. The rest would become a German reorganized government, headed by the Germans. France and Britain could strike now, but it would seem like their window of opportunity has passed. The Germans would have a very good chance to take over the continent. That's not to say that it would be as easy for them as it was historically. The reason for that is that the war between them and the Allies would start in 1943, quite literally 4 years later. This would give the Allies a lot of time to prepare for the war. Even if the Germans managed to reach Paris, it's unlikely that the French would just surrender as they did historically. In Asia, Japan would also be screwed, as they lacked the resources to conquer all of China. Historically, they were importing a lot of resources from countries like France, Britain and the United States. The reason why Japan decided to strike south, declaring war on all of these countries, was that the United States put an embargo on Japan. The Japanese, out of pure desperation, declared war on all of these countries, so they would have a chance at seizing their resources in East Asia and continuing the war. Without the Germans being at war with the Allies, I don't think that the Japanese would strike south. This is because if they do, they would be facing all of these countries alone, as Germany wouldn't be fighting them. Here, I will split the scenario in two. What if the Germans ended up invading the Allies, and what if they don't? The scenario where they wouldn't invade would go like this. The Japanese would for sure get defeated, as the Germans would maybe even start helping the Chinese, as they had done historically. Japan would peace out and lose many lands in the process. Nationalist China would also come out on top, defeating the communists. I think that they would ally with the Germans and the German puppet states of the former Soviet Union. Other than that, a new Cold War would take place between the ultra-nationalist countries and the democracies. The playing field would be pretty even. The Americans would develop a nuclear bomb, which would scare the Germans. Historically, Germany saw nuclear science as Jewish science, so they wouldn't invest too much in it. Historically, at one point, they even stopped funding their nuclear program because they were so much behind. This would all change in this timeline, as the situation in Europe would be very different. The more interesting option is what if the Germans in the British faction ended up being at war. This would most likely begin in mid-1943, with Italy, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria partitioning Yugoslavia. The Allies would put their foot down and declare war on them, with Germany soon joining in on the war, calling all of their allies. The Germans were already overstretched, having to garrison most of the Soviet Union, which they had just conquered. Millions of Germans would be occupied in Russia, putting down communist rebellions, partisans and separatist movements. The Germans would try to go around the Maginot Line, where they would have some initial success, but would for sure get stuck before they reach mainland France. In 1944, I assumed that they would break through the Ardennes forest, surprising the Allies. This would secure a lot of gains quickly, but the German army would get stuck once again, but not before reaching the sea and encircling Dunkirk. The war on this front is starting to look more like a repeat of the First World War, with trench warfare being established. Historically, the nuclear bomb was developed in mid-1945, so the Germans don't have a lot of time, right? Well, it's uncertain if the United States will join the war or not. Even if they do join, the United States nuclear program began in 1939, and it was sped up in 1941, after the United States entered the war. If the United States doesn't join the war, or joins in 1945, the nuclear bomb wouldn't be ready at least until 1946. This leads me to think that the bomb wouldn't be used for the duration of the conflict, but this is up for debate. With no side being able to push the other, while having millions die on the front lines, and cities being bombed into oblivion, maybe there is a peace deal to end the conflict. It would slightly favor the Germans, with them getting Alsace-Lorraine and protectorate over the Netherlands and Belgium, expanding the latter. Neither side would accept these borders as permanent, so war between the two is likely to continue. This would happen years later, as the German Chancellor's health was on the decline. After his death, if the Germans don't keep hold of their puppet governments, the Allies would sense weakness and attack, most likely ending the German Reich. This scenario would be very interesting, as the world would become ruled by only democratic countries, or at least there wouldn't be any major power that isn't democratic. You should check out this video about the alternate world future, starting from 2023 and ending in 2100. See you there!